Welcome back to the Design Principles podcast. I'm Sam Brown from Arete Architects, and I'm here today with Ben Sutherland from BR Architecture and Gerard Dombrowski from Gerard Dombrowski Workshop. Welcome back, boys.
Thank you.
This week, we've decided that we're going to discuss and tackle the subject of high-performance architecture. Quite often, I've found that this is confused, or the term sustainability is thrown or is bandied around in the profession pretty readily, with not a lot of understanding of what sustainable means. And I often find that sustainable can be a little bit of a short-sightedness in terms of the building industry. So I like to use the term, I like to think of things that are of that ilk more as high-performance architecture. One of the reasons that I wanted to start this conversation today is that in 2 weeks' time, the New Zealand Green Building Council will be holding a housing summit up in Auckland at the Aotea Centre on the 22nd of May. Get tickets. Where they'll be discussing high-performance architecture, particularly in the housing realm, with a strong focus on medium-density housing. And it's just a very topical thing in the market at the moment, and something that I think we should definitely discuss. So before we crack into things, just want to start you off with a little bit of a description. This was outlined by ArchiPro as to what high performance is. They say there are many design, building, and material choices available for making a home an energy-efficient high performer. They all, however, aim to contribute to at least one of four key performance characteristics. So that's worth keeping in mind throughout the discussion: insulation, ventilation, solar gain, and heating. But personally, I find that only part of the story. And I think the more that we delve into it, things like embodied carbon, water usage, etc., become just as an important part of the fabric and framework of high-performance architecture. So to crack things off, Ben, Gerard, what's your sort of take in this realm, and what experience have you had in it?
Quickly, is this a performance conversation or is it a sustainability conversation? Can we run over that link again?
Yeah, so I think the confusion around a lot of the built environment is people use the term sustainability a lot to try and cover a lot of things. The building industry and construction in general is inherently unsustainable, regardless of how green your building may be. So I think sustainability personally is the wrong term, which is why I like to use or think of it as high performance instead. Because regardless of what you're building, it's unsustainable. But if you do it in a high performance manner that takes sustainability into consideration, it's far more appropriate and acceptable term to use.
I'm glad you called it high performance architecture. Actually, I was going to call you out on it if you called it sustainability.
Nice.
It's just far too broad, you know.
It's far too broad. It's far too broad, and it's far too misdirected, I think.
Yeah.
Particularly nowadays.
So are we saying we're not looking for sustainability and we're just looking for performance, or what's, because like the Green Building Council kind of comes with the association of saving the planet, et cetera, et cetera?
For sure. So sustainability is definitely an aspect of it. And through all of these discussions, you're considering sustainability as a base thought, such as embodied carbon, energy usage, material, all of that sort of stuff. So obviously if you're making sustainable decisions within those realms, that's a positive. But I don't like the term sustainable architecture or sustainable building, because inherently building isn't sustainable. You think 40% of our emissions are either used up in the construction or maintenance of buildings. So the only way to truly be sustainable, or to practice truly sustainable architecture, is to not do any. And then none of us would have a job.
Live in caves? Surely that counts.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think sustainability is definitely, it's a buzzword. It's definitely a focus, but I think it's just the wrong term within this realm.
Yeah, it's an incredibly vague term.
Yeah.
But then it's like because there's all these metrics that are out and they're all incredibly misleading. So like the performance side of things, it's like a car analogy. Are we now talking about like a certain spec of performance? So we're talking about Porsches and things, or like we're talking about Corollas as well.
I think that's where the discussion can start. Why not? And you're right, Gerard. At the moment,
Just trying to bring it into like a lens that everyone can associate, because
yeah, for sure.
Otherwise, only people that know exactly what high performance building are going to know what this chat's about.
For sure. What I see, well, what high performance is currently within the market is something that is performing to the level that it needs to be for us to meet climate goals, for us to be living in healthy homes, to reduce respiratory illnesses in children, all of that sort of stuff. High performance is the term that's given to that because it's higher performing, sorry to sort of use that term again, than standard code or something that's generic. At the moment, I think a lot of that high performance architecture is seen as, to use your car analogy, the Mercedes or the BMW version of housing, particularly in housing. For commercial, it's starting to become a little bit more adopted across the board. But ultimately what the goal is that those BMWs and those Porsches become Toyota Corollas, to continue that car analogy, in the sense that high performance, it may be high performance now, but it needs to and should become just the standard.
Well, do you want to kick us off with an example and tell us, and we can try and break it down as to a better understanding of what makes it high performing, I guess, might be helpful?
Yeah, totally. So actually very recently, Fletcher Living, and it's really cool to see an enormous player in the construction market in New Zealand, and Fletcher's sort of championing this change, just completed the first 10, or not the first, it's the third, I actually think, 10 Homestar home in Auckland. So 10 Homestar is basically the pinnacle of high performance housing that you can achieve under a New Zealand metric, and we'll get into alternative metrics for assessing quality a bit later. But what that house means is it has like a low embodied carbon metric to it, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but go check it out if you want to know it in a bit more detail. It's airtight. It requires very little heating and or cooling in summer and winter to stay at a median temperature of 20 to 21 degrees internally. The construction methodology means that there's no moisture issues, condensation, etc. The materiality that's used is generally all locally sourced. It's 90% of the waste from the project was diverted from landfill, so a lot of it's been recycled or reused. Those are just some of the metrics that are used to determine what is high performance at the moment. But ultimately what the goal is that all of those things just become the norm.
Right. So it achieves in both in the embodied realm as well as the operational realm.
Correct.
So it's about as much about the construction methodology, how it's put together, where the materials come from, what variety of materials they're using to lower that impact.
Exactly.
As well as the operational costs, which are your reduction in energy consumption, your perhaps, increase better, ventilation, whether that be passive or mechanical.
Yep.
So it's just a combination of, the embodied and the operational to create like a more superior built structure.
Yeah, it's it's not necessarily a more superior built structure. It's a more superior built environment. And there's lots, I mean, I
didn't want to say a high performing
we're touching the tip
piece of architecture.
I mean, we're touching the tip of the iceberg here. There's so many things that contribute to this. Scale of the building is one of them. I think, building a 300 to 400 plus square meter home is inherently unsustainable, and it's going to be very difficult to heat and cool that, and the material that's going to go into it is going to be very high, etc., etc. So reducing scale to a more efficient standard is a big one. And to kind of come back to that car analogy, I think you can't get confused with high performance being like super high spec. For instance, like a $5 million mansion on the hills in Wellington or something isn't necessarily going to be high performance, because it may have very, very high quality materials, a very high quality of finish, a very high architectural merit, but the actual performance of that home could be really poor. might have $2,000+ heating bills per month. The material may have been shipped, they might have used non-FSC timber hardwoods for the decking or something, and shipped their windows all in from Germany. All these little things contribute to lowering that level of high performance, not necessarily high quality.
Yeah, I think the confusion comes in when you get that mention that is accredited to these Homestar or what have you. Because you can, I guess, ultimately pull off a large building that would tick some of the boxes.
Oh, you totally can, and we're doing it currently. Our practice is currently doing it in Wellington. We've got a client, Rob Seymour, who's building a large home on the hills, difficult site in Wellington, and it's an incredibly high performance home. It's achieved at its last. It's incredible. It's a very complex envelope, and it was our aim to sort of achieve a high Homestar standard or close to, and use passive house principles, but without really targeting those actual certifications. And we're achieving it, and it's so you can do it at that higher level. What I'm just saying is it's less common, because generally the focus with projects of that scale is more on aesthetic and, I don't know, just having nice travertine tiles or something, rather than actually considering what your interior temperature is all year round without having insane power bills.
Love me some travertine. Beautiful stone. So I guess for anybody confused or not overly familiar with the term high performance, it is kind of the next gen of the sustainable conversation, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it's the more accurately targeted iteration of the sustainability chat.
Yeah. So we are searching for low carbon, low running cost, low embodied what's-its.
Yeah. Low water usage, low energy usage. And a lot of these houses and commercial properties as well, there's the Scion Centre in Rotorua. I think it has a 6 Green Star rating off the top of my head, which is the highest level of certification that you can get in New Zealand. It's just recently won an international award for an environmental building award. And that basically is a net zero building. So it generates all its own power, it recirculates and reticulates and cleans its own water, all those sort of things, So what we're looking at is buildings that, where possible, don't have a negative impact on the environment in which they inhabit and also the environment in which they draw from. So particularly somewhere like New Zealand, where we have limited access to power and we want to maintain this clean green image, I think it's pretty important that we're sort of striving to create buildings that mimic that nationwide mantra as well.
So that's using renewable resources like timber as much as possible. Or so what are some ways that techniques they're using to achieve that?
Lots of companies are kind of taking on different approaches. So we actually just had a rep from Ortex come and chat to us recently, and what they're doing now is they're taking all of their, so Ortex are acoustic panel suppliers, for those not in the know, and they're taking a lot of their material from offcuts from build sites where it's not used, second life material, what have you, and then recycling it and repurposing it into new products.
Okay.
So they've just recently released, I don't have the sample with me, but a new acoustic panel that's purely recycled material. So what they're looking at is second life, third life, fourth life material. And a good example of that is polystyrene. If you said polystyrene and sustainability, you wouldn't necessarily think that the two run in the same conversation, but it's a completely inert product once it's manufactured, and it has an almost infinite recycle life cycle. So for instance, if you're using rigid insulation in your underfloor, X-Bowl for example, any of those offcuts that you don't use on site, you can give back to them. They'll repurpose and put back into product. And as it slowly, because all products slowly degrade after each life cycle use, but they're continually finding new methods for recycling and reusing them. So those are just a couple of examples. For instance, sorry, Karen.
Just with that polystyrene, what's the threshold between like having it last a long period of time versus something that doesn't cost a lot environmentally to manufacture in the first place?
I think it's a balance, right? Concrete, for instance, is similar, high embodied carbon in manufacturing, but will last forever, and also can be is highly recyclable. So there's no magic wand. There's no like golden answer. I think for those that are interested, it's worth just doing your research when it comes to product specification and product use, because depending on what you're wanting to use, it's good to have a narrative around why you're using it from that perspective as well. Second life materials are they're sort of a no-brainer, particularly stuff where there's low there's low manufacturing in the second stage. So for instance, we specify a lot of reclaimed eucalypt cladding, which comes out of Australia. It's made from beams, railway sleepers, telephone poles, stuff that's pulled out of old construction. Yeah. All it's done is it's milled, so there's not a lot of cost in that. Yep. And then it's a Class 1A timber, so it's 40-year out-of-ground warranty, untreated. So as a cladding, it's like bomb-proof. And that's a second life material, so there's very little cost goes into that, and it will last forever. So that's a good example. And all that takes is a little bit of digging and a little bit of curiosity around why you should use a product, rather than just saying, I use it because I use it.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to bring this up later on, but so MBIE next year is bringing out carbon counting. So basically, starting 2025, it's going to be mandatory for new buildings, emphasis on the new, to report on their whole of life embodied carbon. So basically, I'm not sure how they're going to do it yet, perhaps with the help of brands or someone along those lines. But essentially, we're going to have to start calculating the embodied carbon within our materials that we're specifying. That's going to be quite interesting, because I would imagine, like we were saying before about polystyrene having such a high embodied carbon because it takes a lot to manufacture. However, I believe the way that they're going to get around that is with the calculations, you can actually adjust the lifespan calculation. So typically with the building code at the moment, you can't go under that 50-year lifespan, but being able to calculate for a longer lifespan will definitely help a lot of those materials like polystyrene and that sort of thing. However, if you're going to calculate for a longer lifespan, I think that you also have to bring all the materials up to that level to be able to.
For sure. And that lifespan's a really interesting one, right? So currently, the building code requires buildings to last for a minimum of 50 years. But so often, products are marketed at or developed for that 50-year minimum lifespan only. So essentially, after 50 years, it all just turns to shit. And in a lot of cases, for instance, claddings, a lot of claddings, it's only a 15-year warranty and things like that. So what ultimately would be lovely is if everything brought itself up. So instead of us designing for a home that lasts 50 years, which for us as young architects is pretty sad to know that by the end of our lifespan, half our buildings might have been demoed or had to be demoed or fallen down, we start designing to 100 years or something along those lines. And if you think about like a to-code home or a built-to-code home, that dreaded term, think about what's gone into that. You've got H1 treated timber, that's lifespan's 50 years. Is it recyclable? No. You've got not wool insulation, sorry, you've got like pink bat insulation. Is that recyclable? How long does it last? 50 years. Is it recyclable? No. There's so many materials that go into these sort of standard construction type homes that don't have second life costs, that aren't recyclable and only last 50 years. So actually the embodied carbon, although upfront might not be really high for these products, over the course of a lifetime, they could be, which is an interesting thing to think about.
No, absolutely. I guess that emphasizes the importance of actually reusing existing shells or renovations, how important that's probably going to be in the future, because essentially if you can renovate something, significantly less impact than actually tearing it down, even if you're recycling as much material as possible and rebuilding. Renovations
totally
are likely to be more superior.
That comes back to that, that statement that I made, that really the only way to be truly sustainable in construction is to not build. And I mean, that's not a reality for any of us or anybody really, but reuse and recycling is a reality and is a huge industry that I think needs to be tapped into a little bit more. And beyond housing, like renovating houses is a very commonplace, classic DIY Kiwi mentality around that. But from a commercial perspective, I think there's so much more scope for reuse and recyclability than we're currently investigating or undertaking.
Yeah. Have you guys heard of the Humanize campaign by Thomas Heatherwick?
I think, have you mentioned it on this pod before?
Yeah, I've mentioned it before. Yeah. But reuse is like a massive part of the argument, I guess. So I think in the UK they have pretty big issue with demolishing commercial buildings. Like the lifespans, I forget off memory, but roughly like 20 years or something. So they'll build a building, nobody wants it, so they demolish it and then rebuild a whole nother commercial building.
Oh.
So his argument is that they're all just extremely simple glass-clad tower blocks sort of thing. There's no perceived value in them, so they're simpler to just demolish and rebuild, whereas more complex, more beautiful old buildings want to get reused. So maybe that's why, like villas and stuff, there's heritage on pre-1930s or whatever, but people want to reuse villas because they have a charm and a beauty about them. But it might be tricky when it comes to renovating a more standard spec home or something.
That's actually a really interesting point, Gerard. And again, a big thing for us on this podcast is advocating for architecture, right? And that's what you just said is like a perfect sort of framework for that. If you're designing, or if you've got a home that's the same as 20 other people in your neighborhood or 1,000 other people in the country, where's the sort of like sense of place? Where's that like individuality? Where's that ownership? And where's that desire to make this thing last forever when it's so run of the mill? There's something to be said for quality, not necessarily exclusivity, but sort of individuality and the desire to keep that maintained throughout history. It'd be pretty cool if everything was architecturally designed, if everything was bespoke, then we're obviously going to have so much more care and want to hold on to it for so much longer.
Yeah. They're definitely more likely to renovate and renew as opposed to, I can imagine a lot of those spec homes are going to be torn down just to make way for the same thing but new, basically. More densification. That's another
shitload of demolition going on. Yeah. Demolition is kind of going backwards on the high performance route, sustainable route.
Absolutely.
Yeah, man. Demolition. Someone needs to sort out the recycling in this country. It's horrendous.
Well, the recycling thing's interesting. I know like Auckland had Green Gorilla. I don't know what the status is that is after the big fire recently. But like Wellington, for instance, it's very
wood waste.
It's very place dependent, but Wellington isn't. But like across the board for site material recycling is not great. We've got a site down in Queenstown, which is like it's trying to be net zero waste. It's all nigh on impossible because you're still going to get some unrecyclable plastics and things out of packaging, but we're as close to it as possible. We demolished a house and we're building an old asbestos-ridden house, and we're building 2 new homes down there. The entire home, bar the asbestos, has either been reused or recycled, which is pretty cool. And then all of the waste from site is being diverted to recycling where possible. So plastics, whether or not soft plastics, are being there's like an outfit down there that turn them into fence posts for farming. There's like all the Gibraltar boards, like jib off cuts, all that's crushed down and turned into Gibraltar, which is spread over ground to help fertilize it, and all these sort of things. So there's like heaps of different initiatives. This is
So
with the QLDC.
how did you find those people?
Well,
someone needs to compile a list, because I tried to when my time at Makers, I'd 100% tried to get rid of a lot of the construction offcuts back then. The best we could do was reduce them and reuse them as much as possible, but there was no one taking anything.
Yeah, I can't claim credit for this. We're working with a contractor down there called Compound, who, they're really leading the charge in the high performance and sustainable building realm. They're doing an amazing job, and that project is a Homestar project, and so part of that Homestar process is we have a waste management system on site.
Yeah.
So it's all sort of built into it, but the Compound guys are really the ones that have found all those avenues for recycling and everything.
Yeah,
and it's
cool.
It's pretty easy because it's all just done through the QLDC waste management system. So it's like council driven, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But not every council has that, which unfortunately.
That's awesome to hear. Another thing I was trying to do back in the day is call suppliers ahead of time and try and get them to deliver stuff that was unpackaged.
Yeah, right.
No one was keen. It was just too much liability for them.
Yeah, interesting.
Because in case anything turned up dinged or damaged, then obviously they have to cover that expense. So they weren't keen. But that whole material thing is quite interesting, because going back to that carbon counting, essentially a lot of it is to start to create awareness or exposure of how these materials that we're using in these buildings are manufactured, and try and force a lot of these manufacturers to improve their systems and clean up their processes. So like you were saying before, with the timber coming from old milled poles, it just needs to be as clean and efficient as possible. And that's what's it's happening, is basically you're getting what is it, an EPD?
Yeah.
Or basically an environmental product declaration that the suppliers or the manufacturers have to start to put on their materials, and that's how the carbon is tracked through the purchasing of the product. So soon they're going to cap your carbon footprint of your building that you're designing or whatever. And if you're over, then I'm not sure what happens. I guess you have to change your product, or
you probably have to buy carbon credits, I'd say. And that's unfortunately, that's really the only mechanism for not punishing, but for sort of holding people accountable at the moment, is the purchase of carbon credits. And
well, they could just not let you do it, and you could have to supply something else. It could be as simple as that. Yeah,
the problem with that being is that New Zealand, small product market, is going to it would make things very difficult. And we're pro development, right? At the moment, there's so much positive development that needs to happen. We don't want to handbrake it all. Although
I think it'll definitely force the hand on some of those bigger manufacturers to supply cleaner, greener products.
Totally. But even in saying that, you mentioned the EPDs, the environmental product declarations. I was aware of them a couple of years ago, and every time a product rep would come and talk to us, I'd be like, "Do you have an EPD?" And to begin with, they were like, I'll need to check when I get back to the office type response, which just as I have no idea, no. But, I'm never going to say that type. You know what salesmen are like. But now you ask them and they're like, yep, here it is, which is amazing.
Yeah. Who's checking those EPDs, though?
But even that change in the last 18 months, 2 years, what that means is a huge shift in understanding and a huge shift in accountability, which is just the start, really. And that goes beyond the product. That needs to move into the entire built environment now. And I think that's where things are starting to shift, as people are becoming a lot more aware of what they're putting into their buildings and how their buildings are performing, rather than just what their buildings look like.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because for a long time there, it was really focused on the operational carbon counting, which is, the everyday, day-to-day running of the building, heating and whatnot. Yeah. So it's so good to see a lot more emphasis being put on the embodied carbon counting, which I think is significantly important. It's, hugely important, potentially, arguably even more important, because this this country's energy systems has like a high percentage of clean energy anyway.
We're like 90%, 92% maybe clean energy. So like from a New Zealand perspective, it's a kind of a different discussion than it is overseas, because so much of and this is the same thing when it comes to like, oh, should I put solar on my roof kind of vibe. But for so long, the argument's been like, well, what's the point? Because our energy's clean regardless. But, power's expensive. And, I'm talking to people down in Queenstown who have passive homes or like Homestar rated homes, and one of the people that I've been talking to, they haven't paid for power in the last 2 years, and this is living in Queenstown. Even, they're always in credit through having solar panels and a high performance home. Whereas I've talked to,
so they've got solar panels on their house.
They've got solar panels on their roof, so they're generating enough power to power their home, heat their home, do everything for their home for an entire year. So this is through like the depths of winter and the heats of summer, versus other people that I've talked to down there that have large homes, beautiful large homes overlooking the lake, lots of glass, expensive, amazing architecture, but their power bills are like $4,000 a month.
Yeah, but obviously there's an upfront cost associated with the solar panel.
There is a $4,000 power bill.
Well, they've got underfloor heating.
A lot of people. Like, you'd be surprised, but even like a $600
I run some pretty gnarly power sucking tools in my workshop. And I'm nowhere near that.
But even like a $600 power bill, I'd say would be relatively common throughout New Zealand monthly.
Yeah.
Well, it's the conversation becomes payback when you're weighing up whether you're going to fork out for some solar panels and batteries. Because, like, let's be frank, it's not cheap. Like, to power your house, and then batteries, there's a huge cost in batteries.
Totally. And I'm not saying that solar is the golden ticket by all means. I mean, I've been a solar skeptic for years, because for so long the efficiencies of panels have only been about 7 years. A lot of the materials are non-recyclable. We haven't had good storing capacity until Tesla came and built Powerwalls, which are pretty mint, but they are expensive. They're like $20,000 or 15 to 20 grand or something.
Yeah.
But I think what's also often is, but this kind of comes back to this whole overarching holistic view on high performance. Is you can't look at these things in isolation. You can't look at just having solar as a solution. You can't look at just having low embodied carbon products as a solution. You need to combine those two things with things like low energy use or low water usage and like airtight homes and things like that. So you're not leaking out a whole bunch of heat and then having to use a shit ton of solar energy to repower it. You know what I mean? So
just touching on that solar just before we move away. One last thing I have to say about it. In terms of embodied carbon, did you know that aluminium has one of the highest levels of embodied carbon? And obviously, not to mention the lithium and silicon and that sort of thing, just because of the mining involved in acquiring the product in the first place. So I guess that's like another factor to consider when looking into solar. And not only that, they, like you said before, you can't recycle them. So their lifespan's generally only 20 or so years. So then you have to purchase a new one. So solar, not quite there yet, in my opinion.
Solar's a tricky one, and I think that's where it comes back to that. And this kind of segues into something that I want to discuss next. But like solar, it kind of segues back to that sustainability buzzword. You know, people are like, I want my house to be more sustainable. I'll put solar panels on the roof. Well, it's not. It's not quite how it works. And what I want to lead that into is like, okay, we've talked about high performance and a lot of these different aspects. Well, what is the metrics or what are the methods that we can use to assess whether something is high performance? And internationally, there's Passive House. I'm sure a lot of listeners and you guys have probably heard of Passive House. Lots of people may not understand what that means, but it's a colloquial term, right? Everybody knows that Passive House means it performs really well thermally.
Question.
Yep.
Just jumping in there. Passive House. Why is it called Passive House when it's literally the opposite to passively designed houses?
That's actually a really good question. I think
Because
the idea,
I'm like, are we pro passively designed houses or are we pro mechanical ventilation?
well, we're definitely pro mechanical ventilation. That is a funny
Are
point.
we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, I'm so pro passively designed houses. That
I'm going passive.
Well,
Team
the thing is,
passive.
like passive.
what does passive mean, though,
works.
Gerard?
I think passive works if you have a passive environment, and New Zealand is anything but a passive environment, you know. But interestingly, like
We're a lot more mellow in terms of ups and downs than a lot of the world.
true, but a lot of like those places are consistent. Like, try telling me Wellington's consistent.
That's the
Yeah,
exception to the rule, though, surely.
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, Auckland's pretty
Negative something
consistent.
in
It just rains randomly every now and then, or every day.
Yeah, a bit of wind.
But cycling back to those metrics, so obviously this passive house, what passive house looks at is like the energy use and really focusing on like the thermal performance of the home. But it's really that one kind of critical key aspect, which I think loses a little bit of sight around things like, Ben, you've talked about embodied carbon, water usage and things. So then the New Zealand Green Building Council's developed this New Zealand-centric model called Homestar, which is targeted at housing, and then Green Star, which is targeted at commercial buildings. And that looks at the performance of buildings more holistically. So it's taking into consideration all of those passive house things, thermal performance, energy performance, but also looking at materiality, embodied carbon, water usage, scale, proximity to amenities, all those sort of things.
So is Green Star and Homestar the same thing, just one's commercial, one's residential?
Like, the metrics aren't exactly the same. They're looking at the same, like they're looking at high performance within the building sector, but like the metrics that they're analyzing are quite different.
How do we select one? Or do we just have to...
Well, if you're
select
doing
both?
a housing project, regardless of the scale, Homestar will be applicable. If you're doing a commercial
Okay.
project, then it's a Green Star.
Okay.
That Green Star accreditation is what you'd be looking for. And then
Also...
Sorry,
Sorry,
Carol.
you go. I was
Okay.
going to say, what is an eco home then?
I think that's not necessarily like a certifiable metric. I think it's more just like a concept more than anything else. Like what these are things.
It's a sustainable house.
It's a sustainable house, yeah. But the things that I'm talking about are things that actually have analysis, certification, assessment, are recognised internationally and nationally, rather than just like a sort of a bit more of a well-directed, but just a sort of a bit of a directed buzz term. And then there's also Neighbours NZ, which focuses on the energy efficiency of commercial buildings, which is sort of like that passive house equivalent for buildings, but commercial buildings. And then for anybody, any homeowner, there's home fit assessments. So there's home fit assessors out there, and they kind of take a look at existing building stock and new and tell you whether it is sort of suitable enough to live in. And if you're a renter, you've probably heard of it because landlords were required to bring it up to a certain standard and everything like that. Yep. So there's a lot of things that are leading in that direction. But I think what the biggest problem at the moment is a lack of understanding around what these things mean. And interestingly, one of the things that I've seen, or an initiative concept that I've seen that I think would be the best way of bringing this into the public eye and giving people a very quick and easy to understand method of rating buildings is a star rating. So not dissimilar to your fridge having, a 3.5 or a 4-star energy rating, or your washing machine having a 2.5, 3-star water rating or something. Any house that went to market for sale would have a star rating against it. And it may be, a brand new high performance Homestar registered home, and it's got like a Homestar rating of 7 or 8, or it may be a off the plans group home, new build, but it has a star rating of 3, or it may be a beautiful old character villa in Mount Vic. It has a star rating of 1. you know.
Right.
And
So is this
that,
something that exists, or are you just is this something you're just making up as we go along?
it's not something that exists. It's not something, but it's also not something I'm making up. So it's something that's been floated out there. And
yeah, it's a great idea.
The New Zealand Green Building Council talked about it at the Housing Summit a couple of years ago, and then they've started this campaign called the Homes That We Deserve campaign. Go check it out online and sign up if you're interested in supporting it. But essentially it's that idea. So you as a buyer, or you as a homeowner, or you as a business owner, commercial property owner, you have a very quick and easy metric to understand what the quality of your building is. And it's not like, this isn't a matter of trying to degrade certain types of houses, but it's an easy way of telling the general public, okay, the house that you're buying may look mint, but it performs like a piece of crap. You know, it's like buying those really cool sunglasses off Temu, but then you go outside and they're not polarized and you burn your eyes.
Yeah. So this all sounds awesome, but I have to ask, and maybe you can give us an example based on your experience. How much added cost does all of this add to your construction? Let's assume a standard kind of residential 3-bedroom house sort of thing. Is it a cost that's kind of worth doing, or is it just still just so far out there that it's a struggle to get over the line?
Yeah, I mean,
what are your thoughts?
It's a good question, and it's a question that we, in the high performance architecture realm and building and construction and development realm, do struggle with, because it is more costly upfront to build these homes at the moment. And a lot of the reasons for that is you're using materials and detailing methods and construction methodologies that are not as common in the market. For example, SIPs, for example, recessed windows, for example, ventilation, air barriers and things like that. So mechanically ventilation with heat recovery. These are systems that are sort of becoming more understood and used in New Zealand, but are definitely still in their infancy. But as these pick up, as the momentum shifts, I think that the cost will obviously come down. And as contractors in particular become more familiar with building in this style, they'll become more confident. Because at the moment, they're just putting massive overheads on constructing anything of a high performance nature because they don't really know what they're doing yet. But that's
too
changing.
Much uncertainty.
Yeah. And then also, a lot of the materials that we're talking about, these low embodied carbon materials, they do come at a premium in a lot of instances because it's a shifting landscape in the material supply market. So it is more expensive, but we've talked about whole life cycle costs that will be realized over the lifetime of a building. The problem is, what's the likelihood of people building a home, and actually living in it for 50 to 60 years? It's pretty low. So it is a hard sell. But I think it is the more that people push this change, and the more that this change is realized to be a necessity, then these costs will come down, hopefully.
Yeah.
I think whenever you add complexity, you obviously add cost. And the kind of worrying trend is that, building costs getting a little bit out of control, and a whole section of the population that are in a previous generation would have been able to buy a house or something. So we're slowly locking a lot of the world out of owning a home.
Yeah, and
with rising costs, which is kind of worrying with legislating this sort of stuff and making everyone build a house that's ultimately going to cost them a reasonable chunk more. And then if you're adding in solar panels and mechanical, I think there's an argument to be made for low performance housing. And if you go back to actually allowing people to have pretty basic buildings that are currently very basic, let's be fair. But do we want people to be able to own a home, or it's pretty? Do you understand, see where I'm coming from?
Oh, definitely, Gerard. And to respond to that, that's exactly a problem that we've identified, and I hope and trying to solve ourselves within our architecture practice, is that we realize that this is it's a new style of construction, but it's a necessary style of construction. But the risk is, like you've identified, that it's unattainable for a lot of people. So we've tried to develop like a very simple off-the-shelf housing product. We've got 6 typologies that meet, called Citrus, so they're SIP homes, but they meet all of these high performance standards, but like at a far more accessible price point. And a lot of compromises there come into like scale. So instead of that like GJ Gardner home that's going to cost you 500k being 190 square meters or whatever with a double garage, you have a high performance home that costs the same amount, that's 110 square meters, same amount of bedrooms, same amount of storage space, same size, kitchen and everything, blah, 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 blah. But the space is just used far more efficiently. So it's just kind of better design, but being able to bring it in at a more affordable price point. And then also seeing Fletcher Living, do this 10-star home, which by all intents and purposes looks pretty achievable by, I'd say, anybody, is really promising. And, hopefully somebody with that power in the market can continue to lead the change and be able to provide this level of quality to that sort of more affordable housing market area. Yeah. And in that same breath, sorry, Ben, just quickly to finish, Kionga Ora, for instance, who are providing social housing throughout the country, they're early adopters of the Homestar program, and all of their projects have to achieve a Homestar 6 rating.
Yeah.
So they're leading the charge there as well, which is great.
I was just going to say, and don't some banks subsidise to a certain extent any of that?
Yeah. So ASB, who is it? ASB, ANZ, and Kiwi Bank all provide sustainability loans for high performance homes or sustainability measures. My experience with the banks around this is it's a little bit misguided. They haven't quite understood like the whole home mortgage rate thing, like in terms of like the whole home being a sustainable measure. A lot of these loans are targeted at like double glazing your house or putting solar panels on or rainwater tanks or something like that. So like individual sort of, or putting in like EV chargers for cars or something along those lines. They haven't quite jumped on board the entire project scale concept yet, but hopefully they start to understand that a little bit more. I know after the Housing Summit on the 23rd of May, there's a banking over breakfast seminar with the banks about sustainable loans. So if that tickles anybody's fancy, get along to that.
Are the banks shouting breakfast?
I think that's the plan, yeah.
count me in.
Yeah. So there's definitely, but what I guess what we're leading to, Ben, there is there are mechanisms for cheaper money for sustainable measures, which is great to see.
Yeah. One thing I was going to mention before, which is kind of equally as relevant here, is in the commercial realm, it's kind of similar. It becomes more about like a combination of materials, because obviously you can't exactly specify a timber columns and beams and everything for an entire building. Well, you can, but some of your spans and your columns and that and costs increase significantly. So I guess the best you can do is find the best material for the best area and maximize it to its limits.
And I think that's exactly right. And I think that's the answer for all of this discussion really, is like and Gerard, again, to your sort of your not low perform, let's not call it low performance because that sounds degrading, but like, to code type
standard.
Your standard. Yes, to standard. Your standard type construction, be that commercial or residential. There's a place for that, and then there's a place for high performance. But that's why I kind of like that star rating system, for want of a better term, is that it lets you know what you're buying. You know what I mean? Because I think so often homeowners, business owners, building owners don't really understand what they have as an asset and whether it's good or whether it's bad. And I think that is a shortcoming of the industry.
So just to clarify as well, that star rating, it's basically the same setup as those health star ratings that we get on food packaging now, isn't it?
Yeah. exactly.
How good are they? I swear I use those every day.
Well, who was I talking to? Oh, Eli from First Light said that, I think it was Eli, said that his son won't eat butter now because it has like a 1-star rating on it.
The awareness is amazing, isn't it?
I mean, his son's like 6 or 7. I think that's,
Yeah.
I'm definitely pro butter, but yeah. But but you're right. It creates industry wide awareness, which is super important.
Yeah.
But yeah, and again, from the material point of view, like I think there's always going to be argument for different types of material. Probably not much of an argument for steel, but
strength.
It's strength for sure, but like
span.
But in terms of span, I mean, the quantities that you need are a lot less. But that's
and it's cost. Unfortunately, the cost is significantly less as well. So
here you go. I mean, this is the argument. So
it's a balancing act.
It's a tough balancing act.
It's a huge argument for concrete.
Yeah. So
with the argument for concrete, I mean, it lasts forever and it's recyclable.
And do you know that they're working on I'm not sure if it's all concrete or just a new type of concrete, but there's like a concrete that can absorb carbon dioxide over its
crazy
lifespan. It's a process. It's not called sequestration, whatever it is, carbon sequestering like timber. It's called carbonation.
Right. But even like Firth, all of their concrete now is low embodied carbon concrete. So they're using like different cementitious, mixes like fly ash and things like that to like bring down that embodied carbon cost. So people in that realm are still striving for as best as they possibly can to reduce those numbers, which is great to see.
Yeah, definitely. And it'll only get better with a bit of forced innovation.
It is. It's totally, forced innovation and then, and adoption by the industry is what's going to make this change. And, the dream is that we're having this same discussion in 2 to 3 years' time, and this discussion is no longer high performance; it's standard.
Yeah.
Which is
I wish someone out there would build a carbon counting attachment or add-on to Revit. Probably already exists, but I'm sure it's a bit clunky. But
yeah, I mean, there's tools out there, but it's
early days. Yeah. I reckon it'll be great, though. It can't be that hard to do.
No, someone probably would have done it.
Yeah. As the companies get their data together, it'll be easier to, like, they all have their details on eBOS or something. Maybe those little Revit plugins will come with a...
Yeah. Well, that data thing's actually quite interesting. Because I think, from my understanding, 2025, when they create this mandatory carbon calculating mandate or whatever you want to call it, that will last. I believe that's only it'll go for a year, and they'll basically just collect all the industry data, figure out where things are actually meant to be, and then 2026 they'll basically redo the whole thing based on that data.
Right, interesting.
Yeah. Because they really haven't, I don't know. It's early days, such early days in the process.
It is, and we were early adopters in this realm, mainly because it was just like a something that I really wanted to pursue, and so pretty knowledgeable. But it's nice to have the opportunity to sort of start to continue to educate in this realm, and it's cool to see so many people picking it up and running with it. I mentioned Rob Seymour as a friend of all of ours, actually. At the commencement of his project, I sort of mentioned a lot of these high performance concepts and details and construction methods to him, and he didn't offhandedly discount them, but like he was sort of like, oh no, do it this, the same old way. And then as we kind of worked through the process and he started to learn himself and started to educate himself on the area, he started to champion it himself and now has totally run with it. And I'd say that it's completely changed his view on construction.
Yeah.
Which is amazing to see, and I can say likewise for other builders that we've worked with, where they've worked on a high performance home that we've done, and it's completely changed their view on the construction industry, and it's something that they are now championing in their own business and practice, which is cool to see. And the only hope is that you can continue to sort of have these moments of influence that continue to sort of grow that industry in that way.
It would be awesome if the compliance, the Homestar assessment would come down in price, because it costs like, what is it, like $2,000 or $2,500 or something to do. It's quite expensive.
Come talk to me. I'm a Homestar assessor. I might hook you up.
Oh, you're nice.
I think there's like I like Rob's non-passive house approach. Like, you aim for these things. You just incorporate the good bits, but then you don't. Is there actually a benefit in having a star? Like, is that social credit?
Yeah, and you're right, Gerard.
What's the actual reason for that?
And that's interesting. I mean, at the moment, there isn't really any purpose in having those certifications or anything other than either like self-satisfaction or social cred, as you said. You can
potentially at resale. But
I know, for instance, Rafe McLean's. I know, for instance, Rafe McLean's trying to sell one of his a project for his is trying to sell in Dunedin a passive house home. It is really cool. I went and visited it just for a nosy at an open home a couple of weeks ago, but it's not getting a lot of interest. And you find
too expensive.
Well, that's it. And I guess as a seller, you'd hope that passive house stamp sort of justifies that higher value, but it's not necessarily being recognised. But like we talked about, if it becomes that sort of, the star rating becomes universal, then I think it would apply a lot more. But like you said, Gerard, there is so much merit in designing with passive house principles in mind, or designing with Homestar principles in mind, and using that detailing and using or having an understanding of their metrics, not necessarily getting the certification, although I do encourage people to get Homestar certification. But at least
so you can get
but
$2.5 grand.
But at least if people are designing with those things in mind,
$2.5 grand do you get?
Or at least if people are designing with those things in mind, that baseline is lifting, across the board, which is awesome.
And so, when did you say the conference was?
22nd of May in Auckland, Aotea Centre, New Zealand Green Building Council Housing Summit.
Are directed more towards the higher densification?
I mean, from my experience and being there before, a lot of the conversation, because the biggest players there are generally developers, and so a lot of the focus is at that higher scale or larger scale development stuff, be that small townships, be that medium density dwellings, that sort of thing. But then there's also scope for those of us that work in the more bespoke individual housing sector. I'll be presenting on a few of our houses that we've done, and as ourselves as early adopters of the version 5 Homestar program. So there's definitely scope for everybody there, and there's a lot of industry and material, supply leaders and stuff there as well. So it's a good chance to network with similar minded people in the high performance realm.
Yeah, see what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Oh, well, should we wrap it up there?
Sounds good.
I hope everyone's enjoyed the discussion on sustainability and have learned at least one thing, hopefully a few things. Any further questions or comments, feel free to DM us on Instagram, and don't forget to rate and subscribe.
Thanks again to Connor Dolman for the visual art and Jacob Marshall for the sound.
Legends.
Peace.